376. That was the legal limit. That is how many people the steamboat Sultana was licensed to carry. When she pulled away from Vicksburg, Mississippi, she was carrying more than 2,000. Almost all of them were Union prisoners of war, finally going home. Within 3 days, most of them were dead. It is still the worst maritime disaster in American history, and you have almost certainly never heard the name of that boat. The strange part is not the explosion. It is the silence afterward. Start with the man in charge. His name was James Cass Mason, and he was 34 years old. He was the captain, and he owned a piece of the boat. Not a big piece. He had bought a quarter of her the year before, then sold off share after share. By that spring, he was down to 1/16. He had already lost one steamboat during the war, seized out from under him. He was in debt, and he needed one very good trip. Here is where a very good trip was coming from. Thousands of Union prisoners were being released from Confederate camps. Places like Andersonville and Cahaba, those men had to be carried north, up the river. So, the Army paid the steamboat owners by the head, per man. Nobody agrees on the exact rate anymore. Some sources say $5 a man, and double that for an officer. Others put it lower. The rate is argued about, the arrangement is not. Every extra body on that deck was money. The man handing out the bodies at Vicksburg was the chief quartermaster. His name was Reuben Hatch. Hatch had already been investigated for fraud earlier in the war. He kept his job through political friends, some of them close to Lincoln, at least according to the historians who read his paperwork, and Hatch made Mason an offer. He would guarantee the Sultana a full load of prisoners. In exchange, Mason would pay him a cut. 1,000 men, maybe 1,400. Now, this is the part that turns an accident into a decision. 2 other steamboats were tied up at Vicksburg that same week. The Pauline Carroll and the Lady Gay. Both had room, and both left without a single prisoner aboard. Every man who could have ridden on those decks was walked onto Mason's boat instead. The river transport quartermaster, a captain named Kearns, said out loud that this was madness. Nobody listened because nobody was being paid to listen. And while all of that was being arranged, the Sultana was leaking. Her chief engineer, Nathan Wintringer, found a bulge in one of the 4 boilers. They brought in a Vicksburg boilermaker named Taylor. Taylor looked at the iron and told them what it needed. 2 plates cut out and replaced. 3 days of work. Mason said, no. Mason gave him 1 day. Patch it, he said, and we will fix it properly upriver. Taylor refused at first, and then he did it anyway. They hammered the bulge plate roughly back into shape. Over the seam, they riveted a patch 1/4 of an inch thick, thinner than the plate it was covering. That is the entire engineering story of the worst maritime disaster in American history. A thinner piece of iron over a weak spot to save 2 days. Subscribe if you want more history that shouldn't be true. Most of it was somebody's business decision. And while that patch was still cooling, the men started arriving. 3 trainloads of them, all through the 24th of April. Nobody kept a clean count, which is going to matter later. They came from a parole camp outside town, and some had walked 40 miles to get there. They were skeletons in uniform, and they had been told they were going home. They filled 3 decks so tightly that men slept standing up. The boat was also carrying sugar, livestock, and a pet alligator. 2 days later, the Sultana stopped at Helena, Arkansas. A photographer set his camera up on the bank, and every man aboard ran to the same side of the deck to be in the picture. The boat leaned. It nearly rolled over right there, in daylight, tied to the shore. They laughed about it. That photograph survived, and it is the last image of the boat. It is also a warning nobody read. Here is what those 4 boilers could not tolerate. They were mounted side by side and plumbed into one another. When the boat leaned, water drained out of the high boiler into the low one. That left hot iron sitting dry over an open fire. Then the boat rolled back, and the water hit that dry metal. Water on overheated iron does not warm up. It flashes into steam, and the pressure spikes. Now, put a 1/4-inch patch on that. The Sultana reached Memphis late on the 26th of April. She unloaded the sugar, crossed over for coal, and left again around midnight. The Mississippi was in spring flood, running fast and cold and wide as a lake. At about 2 in the morning, 7 miles above Memphis, 3 of the 4 boilers let go. The blast tore the middle out of the boat. It threw men into the air and dropped the smokestacks onto the decks. Then, the rest of her caught fire. The men who lived through it woke up in freezing black water. They grabbed whatever floated. One soldier killed the boat's pet alligator with his bayonet. Then he pushed its wooden crate into the river, rowed it downstream, and lived. On the Arkansas bank, there was a farmer named John Fogelman. Fogelman lashed a few logs together and rowed into the current with his sons. They pulled men out until his house was a hospital with more than 100 soldiers in it. Now, sit with this one for a second. Fogelman and his neighbors were Confederates. The war had ended 18 days earlier. They spent that night saving Union soldiers, one raft load at a time. So, who answered for it? Nobody. That is not a figure of speech. Mason went down with his boat. He was last seen at the stern, tearing planks loose and throwing them to people in the water. His body was never recovered. One officer, a captain named Frederick Speed, was court-martialed that winter. He was convicted the next June on every charge. 3 months later, the Judge Advocate General threw the conviction out. His finding was that there was no evidence the disaster was caused by overcrowding. Speed received an honorable discharge. Reuben Hatch ignored 3 summonses. A federal marshal went to arrest him and could not find him. Hatch was never tried at all. Which brings us back to what I promised you. Why does nobody know this? The usual answer is that the news buried it, and the timing is almost too neat. Lincoln had been shot less than 2 weeks earlier, and his funeral train was still crossing the country. John Wilkes Booth was killed in a Virginia barn the day before the Sultana exploded, and when Harper's Weekly ran the engraving of the burning boat, it printed it 10 pages behind Lincoln, with no caption, not one line of text. That story is very satisfying, and it is mostly wrong. The historian who spent 30 years in the primary sources checked the papers. The Sultana was covered, heavily, all over the country. The press did not miss it. The country read about it, and then let go of it. And that is the real answer. Nothing stuck to it. Nobody was punished, and no family was compensated. No inquiry stayed open, and no monument went up. The dead were farm boys from Ohio and Indiana and East Tennessee. They were scattered across hundreds of small towns, so no single city carried the grief. And after 4 years of war, the country was numb to numbers, which leads to the last detail and the worst one. We do not know how many people died, not precisely and not even roughly. The official counts from the time run from about 1100 to over 1500. Modern research, working from Army records, settles on 1169. Popular retellings still say 1800. Take your pick, because the government never did. You will hear that more people died here than on the Titanic. That is only true if you use the highest counts. The worst maritime disaster in American history. And nobody ever finished counting the bodies. Over the next century, the Mississippi moved off the wreck. In 1982, a Memphis lawyer went looking for it. He found charred deck timber about 30 feet down. It was under a soybean field on the Arkansas side, a mile from the water. It has never been dug up, so the worst shipwreck in American history is sitting under a farm, uncounted again. In the end, the only number anybody got right was the one printed on the license. Subscribe for more history that shouldn't be true. There is an alarming amount of it, and most of it got filed 10 pages behind something more important.